Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 235, Count de Rossi. Acknowledgement to Neville Arthur Potter's thesis written on Francis Nicholas Rossi in March 2017. I've used some of this information to help paint the picture of this person. Count de Rossi was born Francis Robert Lewis Rossi on the 19th of February 1823 at Port Louis, Mauritius. He was the son of Francis Nicholas Rossi. Francis Sr. was born in Corsica, France in 1776. Francis was the son of Philip Francois Antoine, Comte de Rossi, who through aiding the British occupation of Corsica in 1795, lost his possessions when the island was surrendered to France in 1796, and he was compensated with a pension by the British government. Francis Rossi entered the British Army in 1795 as an ensign in an Anglo-Corsican battalion. In 1798 he transferred to the 69th Regiment and served in Holland. In the next year, as lieutenant in the 5th Regiment, he served in Gibraltar and was favourably noticed for his conspicuous ability. In April 1803 he joined a regiment that was formed to serve in Ceylon and was promoted to captain in January 1807. In 1811 he was appointed aide-de-camp to Sir Robert Townsend Farquhar, who in 1812 became the governor of Mauritius, where Francis Rossi also held the civil posts of Deputy Secretary to the government and Collector of Registration and Mortgage Dues. He was sent to Bengal in 1815 and he arranged for the transportation to Mauritius of Indian convicts. He carried dispatches to England in 1816 and in 1817 was appointed a general superintendent of the convict department in Mauritius. Through the fear that the scattered working parties of convicts might incite slaves to rebellion, Rossi enforced rigorous discipline. In 1822 he married Antoinette Genevieve Saunay, by whom he had two sons, Francis and Alexander Philip, who was born in 1828, 5 years after Francis. Francis Rossi Sr. left Mauritius when Farquhar's governorship ended in 1823, and in August 1824 he accepted the post of Superintendent of Police in New South Wales, offered to him by Earl Bathurst. He took up his duties in Sydney on the 19th of May 1825, replacing Darcy Wentworth. He reorganised Sydney Police on a system somewhat similar to that of the Bow Street Police Office in London. Through his tireless efforts, he made the force more efficient, although continuously hampered by inadequate funds and recruits of poor quality, and even worse, the control of the colony's police forces was divided between the benches of magistrates outside Sydney, the officers of the Mounted Police and the head of the Sydney Police. In appointing Rossi, Bathurst intended to carry out a recommendation of the Commissioner John Thomas Bigg that the police of the whole colony should be under one central authority. However, Governors Sir Thomas Brisbane and Sir Ralph Darling postponed the change. Rossi remained, therefore, executive head of the Sydney Police only, although he had authority to correspond directly with the rural benches of magistrates, and himself was a police magistrate. He felt the weight of his duties, and in May 1827 he was temporarily appointed to the less arduous post of Controller, and in December acting Collector of Customs in Sydney. By 1828, Antoinette's illness had deteriorated to a point where she returned to Mauritius with her youngest son and a family servant, Mrs. Hughes. She may have left as early as April 1828. For that month, Francis sold a large quantity of furniture, cutlery, glassware and utensils from his house in Pitt Street. He was moving to the new Superintendent of Police's house on Church Hill, where St Philip's Church now stands. The Australian newspaper was critical of the benefits given to government officials, and they described it as a splendid house with ample grounds and well fenced on all sides. The Sydney Herald wrote that it offered one of the most delightful and pleasing situations in the colony, commanding the whole government domain, the lighthouse, the north and south head, with the estates of Elizabeth Bay and the harbours of Port Jackson. By the end of that year, Francis began residing on his land grant at Goulburn. In 1829, Rossi resumed his duty with the police. His wife was to not join him on either Churchill or in Goulburn, as she died in Port Louis on the 20th of April 1829 of consumption in what we know today as tuberculosis. Unfortunately, she had not been told that she was suffering from consumption. The family in France believed that she was suffering from liver disease. Mrs. Hughes and Alexander returned to Sydney on the Denmark Hill, arriving on the 15th of September. Rossi may have had earlier news from Mauritius about his wife's death, as he now took a month's sick leave. His health too was now failing, and he was ill again, and in the December spent a month in Goulburn to recuperate, and then returned to duty in early February 1830. By the July he was again unable to work or even leave his room. 4 months later he again took leave to try the effect of a change of air at his farm in Goulburn. The nature of his illness is unknown, but it was most likely as a result of his years in the tropics. His medical advisor in Mauritius in 1819 noted that Rossi was suffering from an affection of the bowels, with much attendant fever. However, by late January 1831 he was back at work in seemingly renewed health, and Rossi's pleasing rotundity, as it was mentioned in the Monitor, was the result of sheep shearing and living on wild ducks, silver eels and maize-fed pork. However, 3 months later Rossi fell ill again. Further bouts of illness occurred, and he again spent a month in Goulburn in December 1831, followed by more sick leave in August and September 1832, and again in November 1832. Illness, however, did not prevent Rossi from being a generous host when Captain Cyril Laplace of Le Favourite visited Sydney in September 1832. Rossi gave a splendid dinner for Laplace and his officers, which lasted until the early hours. Rumours had circulated in August 1832 that Rossi was to be replaced, and in March 1833 he sold his furniture, the Gazette pointing out that it was of superb description and would realise good prices. The gossip said that Rossi would proceed to Europe by the end of September. In 1833, the Sydney Police Act introduced a new system, the application of which Rossi felt was too onerous for his health, already impaired by heavy duties, and he obtained a year's leave during which he was permitted to sell his army commission on condition that he retired from the police. After he retired in November 1834, he lived on his property, Rossiville, in the Goulburn district. The Rossi coat of arms adorned the entrance to Rossiville. It had 4 imposing Doric columns. The interior of the house was not spacious, but the fittings were of fine workmanship, and they're still admired by visitors today. Goulburn's first courthouse, a rough-hewn wooden or slab structure, was not built until 1836, so Rossi served as a magistrate and conducted hearings until that time at Rossiville. He had a jail built there to accommodate prisoners, a common practice for country magistrates. Rossi was granted 3 pasturage licences in January 1837, 2 for Michelego and 1 for Aluni Station. Aluni Station covered 22,000 acres and was capable of running 5,000 sheep, although Rossi used it for his cattle until he abandoned the property in 1838. At Michelego, Rossi built a small shingle-roof cottage of 4 bedrooms with plastered walls, with a low veranda front and rear. Rossi retained Michelego all his life, and his son Francis Robert Lewis sold it to Alexander Ryrie in 1859. Francis long believed himself a British subject, first because George III had assumed the crown of Corsica in 1794, and secondly because of his long service in the British Army. In 1843, however, he found that he was still an alien in the eyes of the law, and he became anxious about his right to own land. On the representation of Governor Sir George Gipps in May 1844, the Colonial Office authorised the issue of letters of denisation to Rossi. With the legal competency of denizens and naturalised aliens to hold land in the colony was questioned in 1845, Rossi's case was noticed by the Governor as one of particular hardship. To relieve the situation, an amending Act was passed by the Legislative Council in September 1847 and given royal assent in October 1848. Rossi's lavish hospitality also extended to balls, and in January 1840 he hosted a ball for 70 guests, fitting out his woolshed as a ballroom where dancing was kept up until daylight. As befits a gentleman, Rossi also played host to Argyle hounds. Rossi also bred horses. To guard against bushrangers, Rossi had constructed at the entrance to Rossiville a guardhouse with loopholes. I have a photo of that I'll place on the Facebook page. It's a measure of Rossi's dedication that he was presiding over court hearings in April 1851 in Goulburn when he was 76, and he died on the 26th of November 1851 at Rossiville. The Goulburn Herald reported that he'd suffered from dysentery, followed by inflammation of the bowels, which later speedily terminated his sufferings. In his obituary, Rossi was described as a somewhat eccentric and hasty, but a well-meaning and honest man, and a particularly shrewd and very useful magistrate. A subsequent obituary wrote that as a police magistrate in Sydney he was a respected figure, who'd always acted with the utmost impartiality, discretion and moderation, and in Goulburn was the object of esteem to all who came within the sphere of his acquaintance. His sons, his firstborn Francis Louis, reached Sydney with his family in the Hercules on the 7th of May 1825. He was educated at the King's School in Parramatta. He married Jane Hannah Sowerby on the 15th of December 1847 at St Saviour's in Goulburn. Jane was born in 1823 in Beckermet, Cumberland, England, and she was the eldest daughter of Reverend William Sowerby. In 1851, Francis inherited Rossiville after his father's death, and he remained at Rossiville performing the duties of magistrate in Goulburn like his father, and he'd been appointed to the local government council in June 1847. He enjoyed his position as a colonial squire. He extended and improved Rossiville, which was in fact robbed by Ben Hall and John Gilbert in 1864, and he played with enthusiasm and some success the role of a hospitable country gentleman. From 1866 he was a sheep director for Goulburn. He was made Registrar of the District Court of Goulburn in 1870, and he was active in local and church affairs and pursued a military career of sorts, being captain of the Goulburn Volunteer Rifles in 1870. He was considered to be a steady and reliable son, but he was of a querulous disposition, and he conducted prolonged legal disputes with the Bishop of Goulburn over land that he donated to the church. More famously, he entered into another dispute with the bishop over a plaque commemorating his parents, which Francis hung without permission in the cathedral. This led to his celebrated occupation of and eviction from the Goulburn Cathedral in 1891. Francis inherited some of his father's impetuosity. He doggedly pursued his claims and attempted to right what he had perceived as grievances, which brought him into conflict with the military, the state and the church. In 1883, Francis left his wife and ceased to support her, and in November 1892 she divorced him for desertion. On the 9th of November 1892 in the Goulburn Herald, in the divorce court yesterday, there was no appearance of the respondent. There was a suit for a divorce on the grounds of desertion brought by Jane Hannah Rossi against Francis Robert Lewis Rossi. The parties were married on the 15th of December 1847 at the Church of England in Goulburn. They lived together until 1883, and in March of that year the respondent left his wife, and she had not seen him since. The respondent gave no reason for leaving his wife, and he has not supported her since. His Honour granted a decree nisi returnable in 3 months with costs, and included in it an agreement between the parties under which the respondent will vest £1,000 in trustees in lieu of alimony until the decree is made absolute. In 1890, Francis sold Rossiville for over £15,000 to the government for a lunatic asylum. A nearby property, Kenmore, had been acquired already for this purpose, and the mix-up led to an official investigation. Francis married for the second time on the 29th of September 1894 to Florence Jane Haley of Barrel. In 1896, Francis obtained his grandfather's title of Comte de Rossi following the death of the then Count in France. The original title of Count de Rossi was an Italian one and dated from the 4th century. The present title was created by Louis VIII of France. Francis's great-grandfather owned several estates in Corsica, which were confiscated through his having espoused the British cause, and he was forced to leave the country. Subsequently, he went to Palermo, Sicily, where he died. Francis's grandfather had an aversion to using the title and allowed it to be adopted by a younger brother. But at the latter's death, Count de Rossi was persuaded to assume the title of his cousin, Captain de Guin, Deputy Minister of Marine in France. Curiously, Roulhac de Rochebrune notes that the French consul in Sydney, Georges d'Aunay, advised the French authorities that since the Rossis had never sought British nationality, they were still technically of French and were able to assume this hereditary title. Francis's biographical entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography states that if there was any way of making a difficult situation worse, Rossi would invariably find it. He's even been celebrated in a play by a local playwright, Tony Spicer, called The Mad Count's Revenge. Francis died in Sydney in 1903, like his brother Alexander Philip, without children. On the 14th of November 1903 in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, it outlines his death. Count Francis Louis de Rossi died suddenly at his residence in Phillip Street yesterday morning. He collapsed suddenly and life was extinct before the services of a medical man could be secured. The Count had been slightly indisposed and had consulted Dr. Bowker, but on Monday night he attended the Governor's levee at Parliament House and was then apparently in his usual health. Count de Rossi was the son of Francois Nicholas de Rossi. In 1824 his father came to New South Wales, being appointed by the late Earl of Bathurst to the post of Superintendent of Police in New South Wales. Count de Rossi's father acquired considerable property in the Goulburn and Queanbeyan districts and was instrumental in obtaining from the Crown a grant of land for the erection of the Anglican Church of Goulburn. It was in this connection with this church, which was subsequently made a cathedral, that Captain Rossi engaged in a long drawn-out dispute with the church authorities in 1890 and 1891. The deceased occupied a position in the government service at Goulburn for a number of years and took a prominent part in the formation of the local volunteer corps, in which he rose to the rank of captain. The title of the Count came to the deceased gentleman in a somewhat peculiar manner, and the manner was thus spoken of in a paragraph published in 1896. The more intimate friends of Captain Rossi were aware that he had an uncle, who was the commandant of the naval arsenal at Brete. But as this nobleman had two sons, it was considered only remotely possible that our Australian captain would ever succeed the title, and it may be said for the captain that he is not one who ever exhibited any desire for such distinction. The unexpected, though, happened. He is now the chief representative of an ancient and very illustrious family, and will henceforward be known as Count de Rossi. The murder of a captain named Rossi some few months ago in the New Hebrides, being reported in France, caused inquiries to be made by the consulate here by the relatives in France of our Captain de Rossi, theirs being the only family of that name in the country. Correspondence between the families was, it would appear, not frequent, for when Lord Sherbrooke was Agent General for New South Wales, inquiry was made in London by the then Count de Rossi as to the welfare of the family here, and the outcome of the late tragedy in the New Hebrides had led to fresh inquiries. A letter of recent date from the nephew of the late Count M. de Gesnay, Commissioner de la Marine de Guerre Francois, Attaché Ministre de Marine in Paris, informs Captain Rossi that he is the only male survivor in direct line of the family and therefore, by the patent of nobility conferred by Louis VIII of France and Navarre, which orders that the title and estates pertaining to the country shall devolve in perpetuity through the heirs male, he is by hereditary the fourth Count de Rossi. His father, it would appear, should have been the second Count of this name in France, but entering the British service at the age of 14, under the auspice of the Earl of Minto, as ensign in the Anglo-Corsican regiment, and being of strong pro-British sympathies, he seems to have abdicated his right to the title in favour of his younger brother, Don Grace de Rossi. After the evacuation of Corsica by the British, this Francois Nicholas de Rossi, father of the present Count, was transferred to the 69th Regiment, served with the Duke of York in Holland, and was afterwards favourably noticed by the Duke of Kent, father of Queen Victoria, for his soldierly qualities. He served in Holland, the Mediterranean, Gibraltar, Ceylon, and Mauritius. Francis, whom we have so long known as Captain Rossi, was honoured by the offer of a commission in the British service without purchase by his father. He then being in an infirm state of health, he waived this, a coveted distinction in favour of his brother Alexander, who served in the colonies and in India. The late Count leaves a widow. And in another article on the 15th of November 1903 in the Sydney Sunday Times, the late Count de Rossi, or Captain Rossi as he is more widely known, was one of the most active men mentally of his day. He was a fighter of bulldog tenacity. The word compromise was unrecognised by him. He had a dispute with the government once over his commission in the Goulburn Volunteers, and after years of battling, secured an admission of the justice of his cause. The Goulburn Cathedral dispute, however, was the greatest experience of his life. It monopolised his whole thought for many years, and he was constantly in touch with the courts over it. His name will be remembered in connection so long as there is a Goulburn Cathedral, and how he held the edifice against those who would remove him will be a tale oft told in the district in years to come. And on the 18th of November 1903 in the Surrey Hills Sydney Sportsman, It is so long since Captain Francis Rossi of Rossiville near Goulburn owned racehorses that the fact is practically unknown to the present generation of turfites. The captain who a few years ago came into the French title of Comte de Rossi, though not a native, was very close to it as he came to New South Wales with his father in 1824 when but an infant. His father was a police magistrate and collector of customs and had a large estate near Goulburn where he dispensed profuse hospitality, as did his son. At Rossiville, the Rossis entertained no less than 13 governors of New South Wales on their periodical visits to the district. Captain Rossi had passed his 80th year, though he did not look it, and had left a widow. Captain Rossi was a born fighter who did not know the meaning of the word compromise. And on the 28th of November 1907 in the Goulburn Evening Penny Post, the late Count de Rossi's estate. The claim of Countess de Rossi to Bishop Thorpe and certain lands at Goulburn, the property of her late husband Count de Rossi, and matters affecting state and bishopric of Goulburn. The dealings between the late Count de Rossi and successive bishops of Goulburn in connection with the property were detailed. The solicitor for the estate strongly believed that the Countess had rights which so far had not been recognised. Mr. Broughton said that as the result of considerable litigation, the lands in question were vested in the bishopric of Goulburn under the Real Property Act. He believed the inquiry by a select committee might result in an act of justice to a deserving lady. The Premier said it would be a dangerous thing to reopen litigation of this kind. The courts, as a result of a number of contests, had ultimately decided against the late Count's contention. So far as he could understand from the discussion, one point of litigation was in connection with the land on which the cathedral now stands. The claim for the cathedral site had been determined against the Count by the courts, and the only way any decision by a select committee on the subject must be absolutely ineffective. If any wrong had been done to the Countess, her remedy was to proceed against the Real Property Fund for compensation. There was another piece of land to which the late Count laid claim. It was situated in the vicinity of the Kenmore Asylum and formed a piece of 100 acres in excess of the grant made to the Count's father. The Crown had resisted the claim and proclaimed the area a water reserve. The proper way to test the matter was to take it to the courts. The committee, if appointed, would be called upon to perform the duties of a court of law and to give a decision which would tax the ability of any court of justice. Mr. James said he did not see that the committee could make any recommendations at all. This lady could place any title she had before the examiners, but as she had not done so, they passed the title placed before them. That being so, there would be no duty for the committee to perform. Mr. Ball said the matter had been investigated over and over again in the law courts, and the committee could do no good. The motion was negatived on a decision by 33 to 13. And on the 18th of May 1910 in the Burrangong Argus in New South Wales. Long legal dispute. Francis Lewis Rossi gave 163 acres of land to the bishops of Goulburn in 1865, with the object, it is alleged, to be dedicated to the site of a residence for him and his successors. This came before the courts on Friday when Dr. Barlow, the present Bishop of Goulburn, proceeded against Florence de Rossi to restrain her from further proceeding in an ejectment action. A few years ago, Francis Rossi made a demand upon Dr. Barlow for the land, and this demand being refused, Rossi lodged an application under the Real Property Act of 1900 for a certificate of title, but was unsuccessful. When Rossi died, intestate, in October 1904, the defendant was appointed administrator of his estate. On the 3rd of August, the defendant claimed to be absolutely entitled to the lands, causing a writ of ejectment against the plaintiff to be issued. The plaintiff now wished that the defendant refrain from further prosecuting and declared that the Bishop of Goulburn and his successors were entitled to the land, and that in the alternative it be declared that the defendant as administratrix held the lands in trust for a site, for a residence, for the Bishop of Goulburn, and might be ordered to execute such deeds might be necessary to vest the legal estate in the land in such persons as the court may deem fit as trustees for the purpose, and that an inquiry be ordered as to what improvements had been erected on the lands and an account taken as to what compensation the defendant should pay. His Honour ordered a stay of proceedings in the equity suit until the action for ejectment could be determined and a question of costs being reserved. And on the 3rd of September 1910, so 4 months later, in the Murchison Times and Day Dawn Gazette in Western Australia, Finality has been reached in the protracted litigation between Countess de Rossi, administratrix of the estate of the late Francis Louis Count de Rossi, and the Bishop of Goulburn. The action was based on the recovery of 150 acres and 34 purchase of land in Goulburn, on the portion of which the bishop's home stands. On the application of counsel for the plaintiff, the court record was withdrawn and the matter, which had been before the court for more than 30 years, was terminated. Jane Hannah Rossi died on the 21st of April 1913 at Hunters Hill in New South Wales, aged 90, and there was a small mention in the Goulburn Evening Penny Post of her death on the 24th of April 1913. Mrs. Jane Hannah Rossi, the first wife of the late Comte de Rossi and eldest daughter of the late Dean Sowerby, died at Hunters Hill on Monday. In the early days of Goulburn, Mrs. Rossi was well known as a hospitable hostess, and Rossiville on Saturday afternoons was the scene of much entertainment. His second wife, Florence, died in 1920. On the 17th of June 1920 in the Goulburn Evening Penny Post, Comtesse Florence de Rossi, widow of the late Comte de Rossi of Rossiville, Goulburn, died on Wednesday, aged 73. Comte de Rossi, better known as Captain Rossi, was for years a prominent resident of Goulburn. The lady whose death is now recorded was his second wife and was the daughter of the late Dr. Haley of Goulburn. And in June 1924 in the Sydney Sunday Times, one of the most picturesque ceremonies ever witnessed in the district took place this afternoon when the Bishop's home, a picturesque old building 3 miles from Goulburn and overlooking Old Rossiville, was visited by hundreds to witness the blessing of the remodelled portion. The house is one of the finest examples of Gothic architecture and was built in 1870 and presented to the Church of England by Countess de Rossi and occupied by Bishops Thomas, Chalmers and Barlow. In 1913 it was gutted by fire, and for years the ruined walls stood untouched. Then the Brotherhood of the Ascension secured it and began work of remodelling. This afternoon the first section, re-roofed and remodelled, was open and blessed by Bishop Radford. An imposing ceremony included a procession of clergy and people around the building, after which speeches were delivered. And on the 2nd of July 1920 in the Albury Banner and Wodonga Express, echo from the 80s, Goulburn Cathedral Barricade. The death in Sydney recently of Countess de Rossi at the age of 73 revived memories of one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of the Protestant Church in New South Wales, the Goulburn Cathedral dispute. The lady was the widow of Count de Rossi of Rossiville, just out of Goulburn, or as he was better known, Captain F.R.L. Rossi. Even prior to the dispute, Captain Rossi was a well-known figure. As captain of the local volunteers, he rode at the head of his company on a splendid thoroughbred, and on Sundays he handed round a collection plate in church. Dressed to perfection and with a flower in his buttonhole, he was a veritable institution. Old residents maintained that he always wore a red tie. He was an esteemed gentleman, a stolid churchgoer, and a humorist when the occasion lent itself, is admitted with a smile of pleasant reminiscence by those few remaining persons who took a more or less prominent part in the extraordinary proceedings of 33 years ago. There were 2 factions in the dispute which made Captain Rossi a figure of statewide interest. The one side held that the cathedral was the successor of the parish church and that the rights of the incumbent, the late Archdeacon Pildercombe, were being invaded. The other faction held the opposite view, that Captain Rossi was an ardent supporter of the Archdeacon, while Bishop Thomas led his opponents. On St Thomas's Day, the 21st of December 1886, Captain Rossi precipitated matters. He took possession of the cathedral and barricaded himself in. Excitement ran high amongst residents when news of the captain's siege got round, and an expectant throng awaited developments. They had not long waited, and a number of intending worshippers, led by Bishop Thomas, Dr. Ellis and Mr. A.M. Betts, now alderman, and Mr. Hayes, sought to enter the building for public worship. There was much parleying between the members of the bishop's party and the captain, with the latter remaining obdurate to all entreaties. A frosted window in the back porch of the cathedral was broken with a ladder, and Mr. Betts climbed through. The public was admitted by Mr. Betts, and as each person filed through the door, the ever-courteous captain saluted them with a cheery good morning. An examination of the interior of the cathedral showed that a tablet in memory of Captain Rossi's father and mother, which had formerly occupied a place in the old church, and over which there was a minor dispute, had been affixed during the night to the wall under the northern window of the transept. The captain had also made preparations for a protracted siege, and in the back porch had fixed up a bed. Captain Rossi was a popular hero of the hour. Any remark by him or on his behalf was greeted with cheers by the residents, who spent their spare time outside the cathedral doors during the several days the captain held the fort. Groans were the portion of the bishop's party from the excited sight-seekers. During the time Captain Rossi lived in the cathedral, his opponents could only gain admittance by one of their number climbing through the broken window and opening the doors. After each forcible entry, and at the conclusion of the services, the captain barricaded the doors anew. Though he was in earnest in his actions, there were many amusing incidents that the captain was responsible for during his occupation. One occurred after the Sunday service when he followed the cathedral councillors into the bishop's vestry. A man was about to take a piece of furniture for the purpose of throwing it out. The captain ordered him to desist, and as two of the councillors made towards the furniture, he planted himself down upon it and prevented its removal. Excitement ran high outside the building, and all that night the crowd jostled and surged and argued the merits and the demerits of the situation. A clergyman and bootmaker, both well known at the time in cricketing circles, nearly came to blows, the man of cloth heatedly telling the man of leather that though he was a minister when wearing the cloth, when he took it off he would be a man. The next day the captain ran out of food, and he was fed with beef tea through a tube passed under the cathedral door. The climax came on the following Thursday. Bishop Thomas, accompanied by two trustees, Mr. Chisholm and Mr. Gibson, demanded entrance into the cathedral so as to conduct divine service. Captain Rossi refused. Entrance was gained through the broken window, and the captain handed over to the police on a charge of preventing by force a clergyman from officiating in a place of divine worship. Asked his age at the lock-up, Captain Rossi replied, "I am young in mind and body, but old in years." Subsequently, he admitted to 62 years. He was committed to the lower court to stand trial in Sydney, but the Attorney-General would not file against him, and so the matter was dropped. The dispute was not finally settled until 1894, 2 years after the death of Bishop Thomas. Concessions were made on both sides, and the synod presided over by Bishop Chalmers adopted an ordinance clearly setting out the rights of the bishop and those of the incumbent Archdeacon Puddicombe. The old residence of Captain Rossi still stands on the banks of Wallandilly River, about 3 miles from Goulburn. A fine structure known as the Rossiville Bridge spans the stream and is a lasting monument to his memory. In addition, if anything more were needed, the memorial tablet, which the captain had erected during the night, still adorns the northern wall of the cathedral transept. And Francis's brother, the second child, Alexander Philip. Francis Sr. wanted a military career for his boys, and in 1841, with the support of Darling in England, he obtained a commission for Francis Robert Lewis, who wished to remain with his ailing father, and he waived the coveted distinction in favour of Alexander Philip. Thus, on the 21st of May 1842, at the age of 17 years and 2 months, Alexander was appointed as an ensign in the 51st Regiment of Foot, the King's Own Light Infantry Regiment. The 51st was serving in Van Diemen's Land, carrying out convict guard duties. Alexander Philip joined the regiment in Hobart Town in December 1842, and when the regiment was posted to India 4 years later, he left with them. Alexander Philip's health failed in India, and he returned to Sydney in December 1848, travelling home via Mauritius. In Sydney, he fell in love with the daughter of a person lately connected with the convict department. Agitated, his father encouraged Alexander to rejoin his regiment in India, which Alexander did, but he was of an independent mind, and he resigned his commission in 1851 to seek his fortune in London. Here he failed to make headway, and he refused his brother's offer of financial assistance. Relations with his father seemed to have completely broken down, and when Francis drew up his will in April 1850, there's no mention of Alexander Philip. Francis left all of his property and possessions to his son Francis Robert Lewis. After his father's death, Alexander Philip lived in Melbourne and eked out a living as a dealer in a floating population of gold seekers. At the time, Melbourne was referred to as a tent city, particularly on the southern bank of the Yarra. Alexander married Catherine Smith, a recent arrival from England, in January 1854. However, Catherine was very ill with tuberculosis and died only 3 days after their marriage. Alexander Philip too fell ill, and he was brought back to Rossiville by his brother and his wife, and it's here that he died on the 14th of February 1855. He was interred in the Rossi family vault alongside his father in St Saviour's Cemetery, just 1 month short of his 30th birthday. In 1884, a prison was built behind the cemetery, Goulburn Supermax Prison, the nation's most secure prison, holding some of the worst criminals of New South Wales, and nearby is the New South Wales Police Force Academy, and its scenario training village is known as Rossiville. So I hope you enjoyed the story of the Rossi family of Goulburn. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.